Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafah, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman, and Atlantic staff writer and MSNBC political contributor Mark Leibovich. So, Ali, what's the latest on Zelensky's meetings? Is he now done with President Biden? Has he moved on yet to VP Harris?
He has, Katie, and we are expecting these remarks with President Zelensky and Vice President Harris to happen soon. And what we can expect is the Vice President to really talk about what we heard President Biden first say during that Oval Office spray at the top of his meeting with President Zelensky, in which he said he was proud to announce this new aid package going to Ukraine today, proud to announce that he has directed the Pentagon to allocate all the remaining security assistance that has been approved to go to Ukraine. And all of this is an effort to really enshrine his legacy as a longtime supporter of Ukraine and its fight against Russia, trying to enshrine that legacy. And another part of that effort is this meeting and these remarks that Zelensky is going to have with Vice President Harris. This is going to be their 7th time meeting. Their last time was in July in Switzerland, right before President Biden announced he was dropping out of the 2024 race. So we could expect the Vice President to tout the work that President Biden has done in this arena, the 20 aid packages that the Biden administration has already sent to Ukraine, and these new announcements today in the form of more military funding, more weapons, an expansion of the Pentagon's training program for Ukrainian F-16 fighter pilots. And so the White House is really using this opportunity to tout the Vice President's foreign policy chops and her expertise in this arena, and really pledge that she is going to continue the president's legacy if elected in November.
Peter Baker, President Biden has done an admirable job of keeping the NATO alliance together. He gets a lot of credit from that from a lot of different circles. Is Kamala Harris going to be able to do the same? And should we expect her policy toward Ukraine to be any different from that of President Biden?
Well, look, she won't come into this with the same expertise and same relationships and history that Joe Biden has, right? Joe Biden has known these other NATO leaders, these European leaders, for years and years, in some cases decades. And he obviously brought a lot of credibility to the table when he had to stitch together the alliance again after it frayed under President Trump. But it's fair to say that even if she doesn't bring that to the table, she's certainly going to bring the same general belief in alliances. And that's a stark contrast from Trump, who doesn't believe in alliances. He believes that the allies are trying to shaft the United States. He's much more hostile towards Germany than he is to Russia. He has spent more time heaping, criticism on the European allies, Canadian allies, Japanese allies than he ever has on Vladimir Putin, who he has called a genius. So I think that the contrast between Trump and Harris when it comes to the alliance is as stark as they come.
What do you make, Mark, of the way the former President Trump is talking about Zelensky? I mean, he was kind of cagey about what he would do or what he would not do, and now he's just coming out and saying that he doesn't like the guy.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a window into what foreign policy was and probably would be if Trump wins, which is basically a kind of cavalier sort of me approach, which is, look, I feel snubbed by Vladimir Zelensky. I feel like he has slighted your favorite president, me. And look, I get along well with Putin, which, he's been saying for 7, 8 years now. He would listen to me. This would never have happened. And, we've heard this all before. So, yeah, it's the foreign policy of me. It's the foreign policy of that has nothing to do with alliances or stitching anything together or working with anyone. It's the foreign policy of one man, one set of relationships, one ego and so forth. So, yeah, that's a window into, just the sort of entire sort of sensibility that's on the ballot in November.
Let's do a callback to a conversation that you had with Donald Trump. You wrote about it in the latest issue of The Atlantic. You said that he told you Republican politicians would be easy to break. You say he was right. Explain that.
Yeah, well, this was 2015, 2016, back when he used to talk to traitorous reporters like me and Peter and JP and everyone. I remember I spent a lot of time with him then, like a lot of us did. He used to talk about, like, look, they might be trashing me now, but I will bend them to my will because these are weak saplings. These are saps and weaklings, and politicians will roll right over when I tell them to. And it was kind of amazing looking back, reading all that, and I kind of sort of sketched that into the future, which sort of paints a picture of Trump having been completely prescient and absolutely correct about, the vast majority of Republican putative leaders over the last several years, just bending a knee to him, which is why he's able to do this and get away with what he gets away with now, and is just one election from the presidency again.
What's so remarkable, Jake, and you know this well, is that he's not in office and he still has that same power, torpedoing the bipartisan immigration bill, which was largely conservative. How much influence did he have over the current speaker's decision not to meet with President Zelensky?
Well, I can tell you what the available evidence is, Katie. The available evidence is that, well, first of all, let's start with this. Mike Johnson said he had scheduling conflicts. He didn't even know if he'd be in town today. Congress left last night for the most part. There's still some people around the Capitol. But he sent a letter yesterday to Zelensky asking him to fire the ambassador to the U.S. because that ambassador theoretically facilitated a trip for Zelensky to go to Pennsylvania to a munitions factory where he appeared with Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor, and Bob Casey, the Democratic senator. Casey is up for re-election this year, number one. Number two, Mike Johnson is not meeting again with Zelensky today. There was a bipartisan meeting today, Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the Capitol. On the Senate side, it included Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. On the House side, it included Hakeem Jeffries, several committee chairs and top Democrats. Mike Johnson did not attend. Now, could we draw a straight line? No. He said he had scheduling conflicts. He didn't know if he'd be in town. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming that for Johnson, sitting down with Zelensky right now would not be good for his political future. Whether that was the exact reason, we can't say. But it would be treacherous. He's going to face, if Republicans keep the House majority, he'll face a speaker race in which he will need, whether Trump wins or loses, Donald Trump's support. So it's probably a stretch to say he calls the shots, but he's certainly the background music of everything that Republicans do on Capitol Hill.
Is he still going to be somebody in a position to call shots if he does lose this next election? Will people like Speaker Mike Johnson, say he's still the speaker, be listening as closely to Donald Trump? If Kamala Harris has a Republican-led majority in the House or even in the Senate, on the subject of Ukraine, if Donald Trump loses, will she have an easier time getting funding, or will it be harder?
I would say this, Katie, it's actually almost irrelevant because most of the Republicans, many of the Republicans have just turned in on policy to carbon copies of Trump on a subject like Ukraine. I mean, there are 220 House Republicans, there are 150 of them, 100 of them or something like that, who don't want to give any more money to Ukraine. The Republican Party, as Mark pointed out in that piece, has adopted Trump's position on every critical issue facing the nation today. The vast majority of them. It is the minority of the Republican Party supports a small minority, not a small minority, a pretty healthy minority, but supports the traditional Republican policies of the past. And I think that's pretty telling.
I think it's also interesting, Peter, that the way that President Zelensky has been talking about American politics has changed as well. He's been much more critical of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance than he had been in the past. What's the deal with that change?
Country is at risk and is being bombarded daily by a hostile invader. And J.D. Vance says, quote, I don't care about what happens to Ukraine. And Donald Trump says that Putin is a genius and that his version of a peace plan would be to give up conquered territory and reward Russian aggression. So surprise, surprise, Ukraine doesn't find the Republican ticket to be all that supportive, and therefore hasn't kowtowed to them in the way that the Republicans want them to kowtow. It's remarkable that Mike Johnson feels upbraided by Zelensky when he held up aid to Ukraine for 6 to 8 months. Basically, if Ukraine has lost ground in this war over the last year, it's in large part because of that. So surprise, surprise again, Ukrainians don't find that the Republicans have been all that supportive.